Says alright, y'all. Says this is the grand finale. Says New Year's delight. Says you can hammer. Machi. Says you can be those people in the videos that almost get their hands hit. Says has some decor, and adds Chinese New Year's themed foods. Says textures aren't great, but recipes and values are nice. Says yellow. Says more crops delight. Says don't hate me, but. Says kinda lame. Says adds 5 variants. Says pale, premarine, skulk, breeze, and amethyst. Says not even sure how you make the seeds. Says SAT values look to be the same as vanilla. Says no foods can be made beyond vanilla food, despite supposedly being a delight mod. Says barely. Says you can make sauce. Says it's just colorful. Says red tear. Says mooncake delight. Says you can make tons of different mooncakes. Says like I'm talking tons. Says SAT values are low, and there's no effects. Says Yellow Tear. Says Miner's Delight. Says Cave-themed food. Says recipes plus values are good. Says great for subterranean packs. Says Gold Tier. Says possibly outdated, but I'm not risking putting down the pot and breaking my world. Says Mineral Delight. Says you can eat rocks. Says Yoon. Says Yumi. Says Diamond Tear. Says Sandwich. Says Slavic Delight. Says pickles, and various Slavic food. Says great for rustic and medieval packs. Says my only complaint is the wild crops have a very low drop rate from their plants. Says Gold Tier. Says Ocean's Delight. Says this one isn't as nice as the other ocean mod. Says I do like that it's actually fugu, instead of just pufferfish. Says Green Tier. Says Peruvian Delight. Says Beautiful Planks. Says these green ones would make great exterior siding. Says adds quite a few crops. Says good recipes and values. Says gold tier. Says pizza delight. Says might be outdated. Says cute outfit. Says you can make completely custom pizzas. Says diamond tier. Says raspberry delight. Says adds 3 colors of raspberries, with ice creams, pies, teas, and popsicles. Says and milkshakes. Says oh man, I thought the other colors also added ice creams and milkshakes. Says orange tier. Says blue and yellow need more things to do. Says ration craft. Says adds canned food, dried food, and ration packs. Says a must have for anything apocalypse. Says diamond tier. Says soldier's delight. Says adds MREs that use farmers delight food. Says also adds the iconic Vimlet. Says diamond tier. Says rice delight. Says adds a ton of rice-based food. Says also adds bell peppers and basil. Says I don't know if only specific things get displayed on the plate or what. Says green tier. Says would be higher if the plate was nicer. Says Maturi delight. Says adds takoyaki. Says also adds yakisoba. Says an okonomiyaki. Says values could be better. I think they need slightly higher sat and hunger. Says yellow tear. Says Erica Delight. Says now, this one is obviously not an English mod. Says I have no clue what it actually adds. Says adds 4 sets of armor and tools. Says I like that these are packages. Says good for city packs. Says recipes and values also seem pretty fair. Says green tear. Says Parfait's Delight. Says requires other mods to make basically any of these. Says textures are a bit high residential IMO. Says SAT values are also pretty low. Says very cute though. Says yellow tear. Says would be higher if more parfaits could be made without other mods. Says Sweet Delight. Says I think it might be Sweets and Sugar Delight on the mod page, though. Says adds a ton of candy and ice cream and pastries. Says my two favorite items, waffle and gingerbread. Says gold tear. Says very cute. Says recipes are also very fair. Says Smitchiano Bliss. Says pretty small. Says I do like that they give effects. Says green tear. Says slime delight. Says lets you eat slimes and magma cubes. Says green tear. Says sniffer delight. Says adds food made from the sniffer and its plants. Says saturation is kinda crazy. Says I get it's pretty rare, but not rare enough to justify the sats. Says yellow. Says wizardry delight. Says not a fan of the planks. Says adds various magical foods. Says recipes seem pretty balanced. Says would be good for a magical pack. Says diamond tear. Says unusual delight. Says you can eat monsters. Says has compat with Twilight Forest, Alex Caves, and Ice and Fire. Says SAT values are excellent. Says good for apocalypse or dungeon packles. Says diamond. Says unusual foods delight. Says different mod. Says some SAT values are wild. Says isn't as extensive as the other unusual mod. Says orange tear. Says vintage delight. Says adds 4 crops. Says 5 crops. Says pickling, salt lamps, cheese making. Says very nice. Says one of my favorites. Says diamond tear. Says excellent for medieval and rustic packles. Says Vietnam delight. Says I love these tiles. Says very nice wood. Says not a fan of the door. Says does add quite a few crops. Says most only have 1 or 2 uses. Says orange tear. Says I almost always use the mod for the tiles, but the crop usage is wild. Says veggies delight. Says adds more vegetables. Says have full tags. Says Green Tear. Says a good way to add veggies to a pack. Says Vegan Delight. Says doesn't add as much as it seems to. Says adds 4 types of tofu, and then like 3 items per type. Says Yellow Tear. Says if you're vegan, go ahead and use it. Says don't really recommend it otherwise. Says Valheim Delight. Says adds foods from Valheim. Says good for medieval, rustic, or Nordic packs. Says good values. Says Gold Tier. Says we did it everybody. Says we got through the Farmer's Delight mods. Says gonna speed through these a bit. Says Boss's Delight. Says for bosses of mass destruction. Says can't see all recipes as I don't have the mod, somehow. Says but the recipes I can see are very nice. Says Green Tear. Says Ether Delight. Says for the ether. Says Yellow Tear. Says does add foods for ether add-ons, but feels pretty small for everything that the ether adds. Says Ember's Delight, Embers Rekindled. Says Green Tear. Says love that it uses the magic system instead of just using ingredients. Says actually. Gold tier. Says Glowberry Delight. Says Glowberry Expansion. Says doesn't add a ton, basically just recreates any Glowberry foods using the Glowberry expansion berries. Says green. Says Gallospheric Delight. Says adds foods for a ton of the stuff in Gallosphere. Says values are pretty high. Says yellow. Says Windswept Delights, Windswept. Says Gold tier. Says Imo, some of these foods should just be in Windswept. Says Avarita's Delight, Avarita. Says add some crazy endgame foods. Says Avarita confuses me, so that damages the score unfortunately. Says Green tier, I think. Says would be Gold tier if I understood the recipes more. Says Culinary Construct, Tinker's Construct. Says adds custom sandwiches and soups, you can make anything. Uses similar mechanics to tool crafting. Says Diamond tier. Says Tinker's Delight, also TC. Says also Diamond tier. Says uses Tinker's ingredients very well. Has nice recipes. Says Forget and Delight, The Forgotten Dimensions. Says Good Values. Says I like that it adds a stove. Says Gold Tear. Says Alex Delight. Says adds foods for Alex mobs. Says a little underwhelming, doesn't add much. Says some sat values are a little out there. Says Yellow Tear. Says Alex Mob's Delight. Says Different Mod. Says the better Alex Mob's Delight, Imo. Says feels more like it interacts with Alex mobs, rather than just using the ingredients. Says this thing's protects from raccoons if you open it. Says Diamond Tear. Says Cataclysm Delight, Cataclysm. Says some sats are kinda crazy. Says yeah, that isn't strong enough for those sats. Says Yellow Tear. Says Quark Delight Quark. Says quark is usually a must-have for me. Says and quark delight follows suit. Says diamond. Says aquaculture. Says plus delight. Says adds various sushis and meals for the fish added by aquaculture. Says diamond tear. Says naturalist delight. Says very ugly textures, but good recipes and values. Says yellow tear, green with a texture update. Says oceanfront. Says delight. Says I keep forgetting DHA tone. Says checking something. Says because it makes me confused. Says solely adds pie. Says just one pie. Says orange tear. Says oceanfront itself doesn't add much, but you could do something more with the fruit. Says Choco Craft delight, Choco Craft. Says green tear. Says recipes and values are good, textures are decent. Says Aquamiri delight, Aquamiri. Says adds some very nice looking food. Says feels like it fits in, rather than just using the resources. Says Gold Tier. Says Tide's Delight, Tide. Says adds foods using the fish from Tide. Says Green Tier. Says the Dawn Era Delight the Dawn Era. Says Yellow Tier. Says I really feel like there could be more. Says Ice and Fire Delight. Says adds a cookbook. Says Diamond Tier. Says feels like it adds on to Ice and Fire. Says fun animated textures. Says Witherstorm Delight. Says high set values, but you're literally eating a command block. Says Gold Tier. Says forgive me. Says Hamsters Delight, Hamsters Plus Light. Says Green Tier. Says good values and recipes, but you feel like a monster. Says I don't like when my food looks at me. Says Goity Delight. Says Ro. Says a whole boat. Wow. Says values are high, but that's a whole boat of Wharton \. Says very nice textures. Says I like that it uses the magic. Says diamond. Says Gobber Delight, Gobber. Says it fits nicely with what Gobber adds, but my gluttony knows no bounds. Says yellow. Wish there was more. Says jellyfishing, and jellyfishing delight. Says come on. Says come on. Says both are diamond tier. Says I don't think I have to explain myself. Says such a cute concept, and not done much. Says and the delight feels like an expansion, rather than someone just using the ingredients. Says ZAWA compat. Says it's just bugs. Says it's for ZAWA, obvi. But gotta say it. Says some of the textures are weirdly low res, and others are weirdly high. Says values are a little low. Says yellow. Says Nearslands Delight, Nearslands DLC, not additions. Says you can eat stars. Says high values, but I'm pretty sure stars are hard to get. Says green, yellow if stars are easy. Says critters delight, more critters. Says again, feels like it adds to the mod rather than borrowing ingredients. Says gold tier. Says I always feel like there can be more. Says Caves Delight, Pispri, Alex Caves. Says I mean come on. Says it adds sushi with the candy fish from Candy Caves. Says add something to each biome, excluding the magnet caves. Says diamond tier. Feels like an expansion. Says Cave Delight, Valiant Envoy, Alex Caves. Says doesn't add quite as much, and really only adds to Dino and Toxic. Says whoa mama. Says I do like the cake and meals, though. Says gold tier. Says would be diamond if it added food to the other caves. Says Vampire's Delight, Vampirism. Says adds food for vampires. Says diamond tier. Says these recent diamond tiers are really what I want. Says an expansion, not just using the ingredients from the mod. Says vampire food sets are low/non-existent, but that's on purpose. You're eating it for blood. Says Untamed Delight, Untamed Wilds. Says Gold Tear. Says somewhat feels like it's just using ingredients, but still very good. Says Undergarden Delight, Undergarden. Says very cute, fits with the theme of Undergarden. Says values are nice, feels like an expansion. Says Diamond. Says Umapioi Delight Umapioi. Says perfect for your horse girls. Says I think you can feed them in that mod. I'm not sure. Says Gold, Diamond if they provide bonuses to the horse girls. Says Twilight Flavors and Delights. Says fits very well. Says good for a Twilight Forest survival thing. Says Diamond Tear. Says Tofu Craft Plus Delight. Says Tofu Craft itself adds various types of tofu, as well as fitting blocks. Says not sure how I feel about it being called Jerry instead of Jelly. Says Green Tear. Says it does add these little guys though. Says but doesn't that defeat the point of tofu if you eat animals made of tofu? I don't know. Says Tofu Craft Delight adds recipes between the two mods. Says but needs an older version of Farmer's Delight. Says serves its job well of patching the gap. Says Green Tear. Says this is it. Says this is it everybody. Says the last set. Says Bruin and Chewin. Says adds cheeses, alcohol, and pickled food. Says needs an older version of Farmer's Delight. Says Diamond Tear. One of the best Delight add-ons. Says Cocktails Delight. Says add-in for Bruin and Chewin that adds fun cocktails. Says Gold Tier. Says some recipes need extra mods. Says drink beer. Says oh god I hate the drinking sound. Says adds cute little recipe boards. Says as well as various drinks, and some snacks. Says very nice models. Says Diamond Tier. Says actually, gold. Says because of the drinking sound. Says Alco Craft Plus. Says much better drinking sound. Says love the recipes. Says okay, works with Tinker's construct. Says lovely textures, good effects, and recipes. Diamond Tier. Says yeast and feast. Says not only can you drink, you can eat. Says decent amount of recipes per added crop. Says cute textures and planks. Says very good for a rustic or medieval pack. Says Diamond Tier. Says that's it. Says the final board. Says I hope you all enjoyed this mod review series. Says like, comment, subscribe. Says next time, whenever that is, I'll be reviewing village overhauls. Says insert epic outro here.